There is a dark red powder sitting on the bottom shelf of your local garden center right now. It costs $2. It weighs less than a pound, and it is, gram for gram, the most devastatingly effective fish attractant ever documented by modern science. A researcher at Auburn University once put this powder in a tank full of channel catfish. 92% of every fish in that tank abandoned what they were doing and swam directly toward the source. Not over minutes, over seconds. No lure on earth, no $50 bottle of lab-engineered synthetic scent, no sonar, no electronic fish caller has ever come within a mile of that number. 92%. From a $2 bag of garden fertilizer. And that is exactly why 14 U.S. states moved to ban it. Welcome to Forbidden Lures. This is the channel that pulls back the curtain on the knowledge the tackle industry has spent decades burying and the government has quietly regulated out of your hands. If you are new here, buckle in, because what you are about to hear will make you look at every garden center you drive past for the rest of your life in a completely different way. Today, we are going to break apart the real science of why this powder hijacks the nervous system of nearly every freshwater fish in America, expose the actual federal laws and environmental crises that led to the bans, and then I am going to hand you 3 completely legal methods to use this substance to catch your limit every single time you hit the water. The tackle industry is not going to like this one. Part 1. The secret in the garden aisle. So what is this mysterious $2 powder? It is called blood meal. Dried animal blood ground into a fine, dark red powder and sold commercially as a high-nitrogen organic fertilizer. You will find it at Home Depot, Tractor Supply, Lowe's, and just about every garden center and hardware store in the country. It was designed to feed tomatoes and roses. It was never designed to catch fish. But that is exactly what makes it so dangerous to the people who sell you fishing gear for a living. Here is the part they never put in the history books. Long before bass boats and electronic fish finders existed, Native American tribes on the Great Lakes used animal blood and fish remains to pull walleye and sturgeon into concentrated areas. They did this successfully for thousands of years. It was not a trick, it was not a hack. It was the original science of fishing, passed down across generations. So when did it become a problem? Follow the money. The restrictions and the stigma around blood baits and natural chumming did not appear until the late 1970s and early 1980s, right when the recreational fishing tackle industry crossed the billion-dollar milestone for the first time. Think about what that means. If every angler in America could walk into a garden center and buy a $2 bag that outperforms everything on the tackle wall, the entire synthetic attractor category collapses overnight. Bass Pro Shops alone pulls in over $7 billion in annual revenue. Their attractor and scent product lines generate hundreds of millions by themselves. A $2 bag of blood meal is not just competition. It is an existential threat to that entire revenue stream. So what did the industry do? They lobbied state wildlife agencies to classify natural chumming as unsportsmanlike. They helped write the regulations themselves. And just like that, a simple garden fertilizer became contraband in some of the best fishing states in America. But here is what they cannot lobby away. And here is what should terrify every board member at every tackle company watching this video. The biochemistry. Because what happens inside a fish's brain when blood meal touches water is something no regulation can undo. Part 2. The biochemistry of the bite. What I am about to walk you through is not fishing folklore. This is peer-reviewed neuroscience. And once you understand it, you will never look at a bottle of synthetic fish attractant the same way again. Fish possess some of the most unbelievably sensitive chemical detection systems in the entire animal kingdom. Picture this. Imagine you could smell a single drop of coffee dissolved into an Olympic-sized swimming pool. That is what a catfish does every second of every day. Scientists measure this sensitivity at concentrations as low as 10 to the negative 10th power molar. That is a number so small your brain is not built to comprehend it. But the fish's brain is. Now here is where blood meal enters the picture. Blood meal is a byproduct of the meat rendering industry, and it typically contains between 80 and 90% crude protein. That protein is a massive reservoir of dissolved organic nitrogen compounds, specifically a group of molecules called L-amino acids. These are the keys that unlock the fish's brain. When blood meal dissolves in water, the hemoglobin protein inside it breaks apart into free amino acids, L-alanine, glycine, L-serine, released in enormous concentrations. Researchers at Auburn University published a landmark study on the chemosensory response of freshwater fish to exactly these amino acid compounds. What they found blew the doors off everything the tackle industry had been selling. L-alanine alone triggered a feeding response in catfish at a concentration of 1 part per 10 million. Let me put that in terms you can feel. That is a few grains of blood meal dissolved into an entire farm pond. A few grains. And every catfish in that pond knows it is there. So what happens inside the fish? Think of the inside of a fish's nose as a wall covered in thousands of tiny biological locks. Each amino acid from the blood meal is a key. But this is not one key for one lock. Blood meal delivers a master key ring that fits every single lock on that wall simultaneously. Scientists call these locks G-protein coupled receptors, located in the fish's olfactory epithelium. When those keys turn, they fire a signal cascade straight into the telencephalon, the part of the brain that processes sensory information and initiates the drive to feed. From there, the signal slams into the hypothalamus, the feeding command center. And here is the part that changes everything. That signal completely bypasses conscious decision-making. The fish does not choose to approach the blood meal cloud. The hypothalamus fires an automatic motor response, and the fish simply goes. No hesitation, no evaluation. It is a pure nervous system override. The exact same reflex that makes you jerk your hand off a hot stove before your conscious mind even registers the pain. But blood meal is not done. It goes deeper. Blood meal is exceptionally rich in essential amino acids like histidine, leucine, and lysine. Histidine fires up the olfactory bulb like a flare gun. Lysine is a primary attractant for every major carnivorous species: bass, trout, catfish, you name it. And when the fish detects or ingests these amino acids, it activates something called the TOR signaling pathway. Think of TOR as the fish's internal fuel gauge. When leucine and arginine flood the system, TOR does not just tell the fish that food is nearby. It physically rewires the fish's metabolism in real time, priming its entire body for a feeding event, increasing gene expression for muscle growth and digestion. Blood meal does not ring the dinner bell. It hot-wires the fish's brain and body to be hungrier than it was 5 seconds ago. That is not fishing. That is biochemical warfare, and you can buy the weapon for $2 at any garden center in the country. Part 3. The physics of the scent cloud. Now, knowing the science is only half the equation. If you do not understand how blood meal disperses in the water, you are leaving 90% of its power on the table. And this is the piece that separates anglers who dabble from anglers who dominate. Here is something most people do not realize. Not all blood meal is created equal, and the cheap stuff from the garden center actually has a massive hidden advantage. In the rendering industry, blood meal is produced using different drying methods: spray drying, ring drying, or batch drying. Spray-dried blood meal is processed at lower temperatures, which means it retains the most amino acids and dissolves the fastest in water. That sounds better, right? Not for us. The cheap garden center blood meal is almost always batch-dried, meaning it has been exposed to more heat for a longer period. That thermal processing partially denatures some of the proteins, reducing their immediate solubility. And that denaturation is a gift. Here is why. When you put blood meal in water, the amino acids disperse outward following what physicists call Fick's first law of diffusion. Imagine dropping a tea bag into a bathtub. That first burst of color spreading outward from the bag is the fast, soluble fraction. It travels quickly, covering a wide area in minutes. Now imagine that same tea bag keeps releasing color slowly for hours after that initial burst. That is what batch-dried blood meal does. The cheap stuff creates a multi-layered scent cloud. The soluble free amino acids blast outward like an underwater siren, creating an immediate, high-intensity signal. Meanwhile, the insoluble protein fractions sit and slowly break down over time, maintaining a sustained concentration gradient that keeps drawing fish from downstream for hours. The fast fraction is the shock and awe. The slow fraction is the siege. Together, they create a scent architecture that no synthetic product on the market has ever been able to replicate. And here is the kicker. You want the $2 bag, not the expensive one. The cheap, batch-dried blood meal from Tractor Supply or Home Depot gives you both layers of that scent cloud. The expensive spray-dried stuff dissolves too fast and burns out. The bargain bin just became the best seat in the house. But before you head to the garden center, there is something you need to hear. Because the real reason 14 states cracked down on this powder is darker than you think. And it has absolutely nothing to do with giving anglers an unfair advantage. Part 4. The real reason it is banned. Now, I need to be straight with you. This is the part of the story that the viral videos and the fishing forums never tell you, and it is the part that genuinely matters. You've seen the clickbait. 14 states banned blood meal because it catches too many fish, because the tackle industry got scared, because it was deemed an unfair advantage. That is a great story. It is also mostly wrong. The truth is darker, more complicated, and tied directly to federal biosecurity crises that have nothing to do with your tackle box. The primary federal regulation governing blood meal is the 1997 FDA ruminant feed ban, found in Title 21 of the Code of Federal Regulations. This law exists for one reason: bovine spongiform encephalopathy. You know it as mad cow disease. This is a prion disease that eats microscopic holes through brain tissue. There is no treatment, there is no cure, and it can hide in animal-derived products for years without detection. The FDA specifically prohibits cattle materials in all animal food or feed to stop this disease from spreading through the food chain. When you transport agricultural-grade blood meal across state lines into areas with strict BSE controls, you are not just breaking a fishing regulation, you are potentially violating federal agricultural transport laws designed to prevent a neurological catastrophe. But it gets worse. The USDA's Animal and Plant Health Inspection Service regularly issues emergency bans on the movement of all animal byproducts, including blood meal, from counties and states where highly pathogenic avian influenza has been detected. California, Colorado, Arkansas, Alabama. These states have seen strict quarantines. If you are using blood meal produced in a restricted area, you are violating federal quarantine laws built to protect the multi-billion-dollar poultry and livestock industries from a disease that can wipe out entire flocks in days. And then there is the most alarming reason of all. 14 states have issued specific fish consumption advisories based on contamination from per- and polyfluoroalkyl substances. You have heard them called forever chemicals. They earned that name because once they enter a water system, they never break down. Not in your lifetime. Not in your children's lifetime. Not ever. Because blood meal is an animal-derived product, it carries an inherent risk of containing bioaccumulated toxins if the source animals were raised in contaminated areas. Dumping unregulated blood meal into a lake means you could be introducing concentrated organic nitrogen and PFAS precursors into waters that are already dangerously polluted, triggering eutrophication, oxygen depletion, and spreading the very toxins those advisories were designed to warn you about. So no, the 14-state ban is not a tackle industry conspiracy. It is a collision of disease control, environmental protection, and agricultural biosecurity. But here is the critical distinction that changes everything. The bans target uncontrolled chumming, the act of dumping loose material directly into the water. They do not ban the powder itself. They do not ban scenting your bait. They do not ban contained application. And that is the gap we are about to drive a truck through. Part 5. Target Species and the Warm Water Rule. Before I hand you the methods, you need to know exactly which fish this works on, because blood meal is not a magic wand. It is a precision tool. And if I told you it catches everything, I would be lying to you the same way the companies selling $60 miracle scents lie to you. Channel catfish are the undisputed #1 responder. Their entire sensory architecture is built around detecting dissolved proteins in the water. Auburn University recorded that staggering 92% approach rate in catfish exposed to amino acid concentrations equivalent to dissolved blood meal. No electronic attractor, no synthetic scent, no vibrating lure has ever come within shouting distance of that number. Carp respond nearly as well. They are bottom-feeding scavengers biologically hardwired to detect decomposing organic material, and blood meal is a near-perfect mimic of exactly that signal. Blue catfish and flathead catfish respond at similarly devastating levels. Crappie showed a moderate but meaningful response at around 40%. Now, here is where I have to be honest with you, and this is what separates this channel from every other fishing page on the internet. Largemouth bass showed minimal response to blood meal amino acids. Bass are visual predators. They trigger on movement, flash, and vibration, not scent. If you fish exclusively for bass, this specific technique is not your weapon. I would rather tell you that now than have you waste a trip. There is one more factor that will make or break your results: water temperature. Trout showed inconsistent responses that correlated heavily with thermal conditions. Below 55 degrees Fahrenheit, amino acid dispersal in the water slows to a crawl. It is like trying to smell dinner through a closed freezer door. The cold water locks the molecules in place before they can spread. You need to plan your blood meal tactics for the warm water seasons, when that diffusion cloud can bloom to its full devastating radius. So you know what it does. You know how it works. You know which fish it destroys and which ones it does not. Now the only question left is the one every angler watching this has been waiting for. How do you use it without breaking a single law? Part 6. The 3 legal methods. In most states that restrict chumming, the law defines it specifically as depositing loose material directly into the water in quantities designed to concentrate fish. Read that again carefully. Loose material, directly into the water. The law does not prohibit scenting your personal bait. It does not prohibit applying attractant to your hook. It does not prohibit contained dispensers. That is not a loophole. That is the letter of the law, and these 3 methods live completely inside it. Method number 1, the high-protein blood paste. This is legal everywhere. No exceptions, no gray area. Here is exactly what you do. 1 tablespoon of blood meal from any garden center. 2 tablespoons of flour. Add just enough water to make a thick, dark red paste, the consistency of heavy putty. Your hands are going to smell like a slaughterhouse. Do not fight it. That smell is money. Roll that paste around your hook and bait. Cast. The paste dissolves slowly, releasing amino acids in a controlled cloud that stays within a 3-foot radius of your hook for up to 20 minutes. Because you are not dumping loose material into the water, this is legally classified as scenting your bait. Any fish that passes through that 3-foot detection radius gets hit with an amino acid concentration strong enough to trigger an immediate, involuntary strike. Method number 2, the filter bag scent cloud. Some people call this the tea bag method. Take a small square of cheesecloth, about 4 inches by 4 inches. Place 2 tablespoons of dry blood meal powder in the center. Tie the cloth closed with fishing line, creating a small sealed pouch. Attach this pouch to your line about 12 inches above your hook. When you cast, the pouch sinks near the bottom. Blood meal dissolves slowly through the cheesecloth, releasing a controlled, steady stream of amino acids into the current. No loose material is deposited. No chumming occurs. In a river or stream, the current carries that amino acid trail downstream for up to 30 feet. Every catfish within range locks onto that trail and follows it straight back to your hook like a bloodhound on a scent line. Method number 3, osmotic bait soaking. This is the most powerful method, and it eliminates every legal question completely. The night before your fishing trip, take your soft plastic baits and place them in a sealed Ziploc bag with 3 tablespoons of blood meal. Add 2 tablespoons of water. Seal the bag and shake it thoroughly. Place it in the refrigerator and let the baits soak overnight, minimum 8 hours. Soft plastics are porous at the molecular level. Through osmosis and diffusion, the amino acids absorb deep into the surface structure of the bait. When you fish those baits the next day, they release a steady stream of scent for up to 2 hours per bait, with no extra powder, no paste, no pouch. You are fishing with a scented artificial bait. That is legal in all 50 states, no exceptions. No chumming, no loose dispersal. Just a bait that smells like the most powerful natural feeding trigger these fish have ever evolved to detect. Conclusion. One last piece of advice that will make or break everything you just learned. Blood meal quality varies dramatically between brands. Check the bag. Look for a nitrogen content of 12% or higher. Higher nitrogen means higher protein, which means more amino acid release in the water. Avoid cheap brands that cut their product with bone meal or feather meal because those fillers dilute the amino acid concentration and kill the effectiveness. The $2 bag at Tractor Supply consistently tests at 13% nitrogen, and it is the go-to for anglers who know what they are doing. We just covered how a $2 garden fertilizer triggers a 92% biological feeding reflex, the dark federal truth behind the disease and contamination bans, and 3 completely legal methods to deploy it anywhere in America. If you want access to all 14 banned natural attractors, complete with legal workarounds, exact dilution charts, and the amino acid profiles mapped by Auburn University, I have put everything inside the Angler's Vault. Check the first link in the description below. If this is the kind of raw, unfiltered science the rest of the internet is afraid to publish, you know what to do. Subscribe, ring the bell, and send this to every fisherman you know. Because someone needs to tell them that a $2 bag at the garden center just made their entire tackle shelf obsolete. Stay sharp, stay legal, and I will see you on the water.